All right, so first we're going to talk about creating and interpreting graphs. Um, I usually start this topic by talking about how awesome graphs are. Oftentimes, graphs are the best way to quickly and easily display data. Many of the things that I will teach you over the next half hour, 45 minutes, these are skills that I actually use in my professional career when I have to prepare data for publication. I use the same exact kinds of graphs and tools in Excel that I'm going to show you guys today. Um, so graphs are really useful, and they show up a lot in newspapers. They show up a lot in blogs, Facebook posts, magazines, and so it's really important for you to kind of get a sense of what these graphs are, how to make them, but also how to interpret them and how to evaluate them as being good or bad, or what makes sort of a good graph versus a bad graph. So for this first part one, we're going to spend some time talking about what makes graphs, how to make graphs and what makes them good. And then for part two, we'll run through some examples of what makes graphs misleading and how to sort of spot faulty graphs or problems in graphs. All right, so we're going to start with this data right here. Now, if you just look at this data by itself and you were asked tell me what's going on with this data, you would probably have a hard time sort of describing the pattern of data that you see here. Oftentimes, this is one of the reasons why graphs are so useful, is that they allow us to see a pattern in data a little bit more clearly. So the first graph we're going to use is an XY scatter plot. An XY scatter plot is used when you have a lot of data points, and they are both quantitative. They're quantitative on both the X and Y axis. Okay, so XY scatter plots, you must have numerical information, two variables of numerical information representing the X and Y axis. And it's when you have a lot of data points. Now, you guys know how to create an XY scatter plot. So we just highlight all of our data. And if you like, you can follow along in the notes. You highlight all of your data. You click the Insert tab. You click Scatter, Insert Scatter. Right? Now, we have this graph, and we know how to make this graph. But one of the important features of graphs is that they need to be able to stand alone, right? Or they need to be able to pass what I call the roommate test. So you need to be able to, any graph that you create, any graph that you run into, needs to be clear enough that if you handed it to your roommate, they would be able to tell you what's going on in that graph. Okay. So with this graph, it doesn't really pass this roommate test. It's kind of hard to see what's going on without having some additional information. So when we are creating graphs in this class, there are three pieces of information that are going to be crucial to every single graph that we create. And that is a title, an x-axis label, and a y-axis label. Now, if you click on layout, you can control all of these individual pieces of the graph here. Also be aware that if you click out of the graph, so I'm going to click over here in cell R8, right? If you click out of the graph, notice your chart tools disappear up here. Okay, so you need to be clicked directly on the graph in order to have these chart tools show up. So we want to add a title and we want to add an X-Y axis labels. The easiest way to do that is to click on your graph, go to the Design tab, and then choose Layout number 1. Layout number 1 is automatically going to put a title and axis label boxes on your graph. So you're going to want to go through and you want to give the chart a descriptive title. We could maybe say that this is % of the population who smoke. Very descriptive title. And for years, we might say for the y-axis, we might say % of population. And for the x-axis, we'll say years. not tears, years. So now we've gone through and we've given a title, and we've labeled the graph. Now this graph is closer to being able to stand on its own. Right? We might want to change this title to say the total percentage, the percentage of the total population who smoke. Now, this little legend over here, this series 1 over here, legends are reserved for instances where you have more than one data series on a graph. So in a little bit here, I'm going to show you how we can add males and females to this graph. Because let's say we want to compare smoking rates for men and women over time. Okay? When you have more than one data series on a graph, when you have more than 2 pieces of data, then having a legend is completely appropriate because it adds information. If you do not have more than one data series, then you need to delete this legend. You can delete it by clicking on it, or you can delete it by going to legend none. And that gets rid of that legend, right? If a piece of information, if something on your graph does not add a piece of information, then it is unnecessary, so we delete it. In this class, if you turn in a graph from now on that has one data series and a legend, you will lose points for that. So make sure you delete that legend if it is unnecessary. Okay. So now we've got the percentage of the population who smoke. We've got a title. We've got our axis label. The last piece of really important information is what we call the source information. Source information is critical to any graph, both the graphs that you create, but also the graphs that you see in the real as you are sort of wandering around in your life. You know, if someone posts a graph on Facebook in support of their political agenda or political position, they should include the source information on that graph so that that someone could go and verify that they aren't just making this information up, right? Source information is critical for the data to be valid, to be considered believable, right? If you see a graph somewhere and they don't have source information, you need to seriously question the validity of that graph. You need to question the validity of that data. Because in the absence of source information, you don't know. They very well could have made up that data. So in this class, source information is typically going to be provided right here in the Excel file itself. If you use data, let's say for your project, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, if you use data from outside of the class, then you will use that source information. Now, what we want to do is we want to copy this source information just to have it on our clipboard, and we want to put it in the graph. Okay, and we want to have this source information embedded within the graph. So to do that, first we click on the graph. All right, so step 1 is click on the graph. Then we're going to go to Insert Text Box. And we're going to insert a text box directly into the graph. Okay, and then we're going to paste our source information in there. Okay. You could type this in here as well if you like. That works as well. Okay. If there's not enough room to display your source information, you can always edit your graph. So I clicked here in the main body of the graph, move my cursor here, and I can slowly pull this up to make room for my source information. Now, this is what I would call a complete and meaningful graph. The title is there, the source information is there, the axes are labeled. It does not have a legend because there's only one series. Right? And the increments on the X and Y axis are reasonable. And we'll talk about increments in the next video, part 2. Okay. For the rest of the quarter, you need to be producing complete and meaningful graphs. If you are missing any of these pieces of information, you will lose points. Okay. Now, why do we have to make complete and meaningful graphs? The reason is for the roommate test. The reason is for graphs to be able to stand alone. Right? If you handed this graph to your roommate, they would be able to look at it and understand what is going on just by looking at the graph. Right? They'd see that smoking rates have been declining over the past few years. A couple other interesting things before we move on about these graphs. You'll notice that when I click on the graph here, over here on the left-hand side, I have two boxes, a purple box and a blue box. The purple box identifies the data that is included for my x-axis. The blue box identifies the data that's included on my y-axis. What's important about this is that once you've created a graph, let's say you make a mistake and you decide, you know what, really, I don't want to include all this data. I just want to include data from 1997 on. You don't want to have to remake the entire graph. So one thing you can do is move your cursor to the corner of this box, and you can adjust the data that is displayed in the graph. Okay, you can adjust the data that is displayed in the graph. Let's say you make the graph and you decide, you know what, I don't want to show the total. I want to show the data for males. You can simply grab the edge of this box, grab the edge of this box and move it around. Right? So I clicked on the graph, brought up my boxes, and I can just move it over here. Now this is showing data for males. Okay. And we'll change our title. Now, let's say you've decided that you're doing this for your project, and you want to include both males and females data. There are two different ways that you can get at this. So the first way you learned last time during the activity, if you highlight this data, you hold down the Control key on the keyboard and highlight your other data series, you can insert two data series while skipping one. Okay? That's one way to go about it. Another way to go about that is to actually just add a data series to the existing chart. Now, the way that we do that is by clicking on our chart and going to the Select Data feature on the Design tab in the Chart Tools. When you click on Select Data, this window, this little widget here, controls what data is being displayed in your chart. Okay? So we want to have the data for men and we want to have the data for women. Right? So first, let's go through and let's edit the data for women. Edit the data for men. Remember, we moved this box over here so we could have the data for men. Right? Now we need to label this, right? Because when we include the legend, we're going to need to have a legend because we're going to have more than one series. We need to label this. So we click on Series 1, we click Edit, and we give it a name, Males. Okay? Now notice, if you look here, it tells you exactly where this data is coming from, A7 to A24. A7 to A24, this is the X data. C7 to C24, this is the Y data. Okay. Now we've got our males. Now we want to add females. So we click the Add button, give it a name, Females. And then we want to highlight the X values. Now when we highlight the X values, they should be the same as the males. Okay? And when you do this, don't worry if your graph goes all wonky like this. That is okay. So highlight the X values. We'll click on Series Y and we'll highlight the Y values. Now, Excel defaults to give you Y equal 1. You want to make sure you delete that before you highlight your Y values for women. If you don't delete that, you're going to get a wonky graph. So click OK. And now we have all of the data for men and women. But the last thing that we need is we need to put this legend back on the graph. Now the way we can do that is by going to the Layout tab, clicking Legend. Now you'll notice you can choose where you want the legend to be. The sort of traditional location is right here on the right. You can, for whatever reason, move this way, right, to demonstrate where the legend goes. Right? And so now we know that this data represents the data for males, this data represents the data for females. So this is how you create an X and Y scatter plot. This is how you edit these data series. Remember, if you have more than one data series, you have a legend. If you do not have more than one data series, you do not use a legend. And we've gone through all of the ways to edit and control different pieces of this graph. Now we'll talk about bar charts, or as Excel likes to call them, column charts. Bar charts are used whenever you have some quantitative variable, some numerical value associated with some kind of categorical variable. Um, this can be used with a quantitative x-axis. So if you're just looking at 2 or 3 years worth of data, a bar chart will work. But if you have a lot of quantitative data, an X and Y scatter plot is typically going to be better. But generally speaking, bar charts are for instances where you have some kind of categorical data, categorical being data that fit in distinct categories but that aren't numerical in nature. These are things like men and women. These are things like religious affiliation, Democrat, Republican, mortality, either you're alive or you're dead, these kinds of things. These are categories of information. Here we have percentage of home heating sources for 1950 and 1997. Again, these are categories of information. Right. Bar charts are really useful when you have a limited amount of data, and especially if you want to compare more than one series. All right, so what we want to do is we want to create a bar chart that shows the home heating sources for 1950 and 1997. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to highlight our data. We're going to click Insert. Now you'll notice when you click Insert, there are two kinds of charts, a column chart and a bar chart. When most people think bar charts, they are thinking of this chart right here. They are not thinking of this right here. For whatever reason, Microsoft has decided that this is a column chart and this is a bar chart. So just know when I say bar chart, I mean column chart. So we've highlighted our data. We're going to insert a column chart. Notice there's a million different kinds of fancy column charts you can do. We are just going to do a boring two-dimensional chart. And just as before, we need to make this a complete and meaningful graph. So that means we need to include a title. We need to include x-axis label. We need to label these series, and we need to include source information. So first thing we'll do is we will insert the title and the axis label boxes. The best way to do that is with layout 9, this one right here. Again, you can also control all of those things independently over here using the layout feature. All right, so we're going to call this home heating sources. And we'll call this percentage. And we'll call this source. We're going to want to edit these series labels. So we're going to want to click on our graph and go to Design, go to Select Data, and click Edit. So notice right here I'm highlighting Series 1, I'm clicking Edit, and I'm saying this is, what year is this? Well, if you're unsure, one way you can double check is look at what the values are, B7 through B14. B7 through B14, oh, this is 1950. Now you could type 1950, you could also use a reference cell. Right, I'll use a reference cell this time, but it's basically the same thing. So now we've got 1950. We'll also edit Series 2, 1997. Okay. Last thing that we need to include, source information. So we'll click here for the source. We will highlight this, copy it, click in our graph, insert, text box. Again, it's critical that you click in your graph, insert text box. It's critical that you click inside of your graph when you insert the text box, because if you do not click inside the graph when you insert your text box, then what will happen is you will put that text box on top of the graph, not within the graph. And what this means is that when you move this or when you copy it, if you don't click on the graph and place the text box within the graph, when you copy and paste it, it will not come with you. Right now, because we've pasted this in, this will come with us to our Word document. If I do it this way, and I don't click on my graph and I insert a text box, notice I'm not clicked on my graph. Now when I move this, notice my source box is still over here. Okay, so you've got to make sure you click on the graph itself in order to get that source information directly in there when you insert the text box. All right, so home heating sources graph. This is a complete and meaningful graph. Again, passes the roommate test. Your roommate would be able to look at this and they'd be able to tell, well, it looks like, people in the 1950s used a lot more coal. Nowadays, it looks like people use a lot more electric and natural gas. There's a lot of different things you could talk about with this graph. All right, the last graph that we're going to use is kind of a special graph. These are pie charts. Pie charts are very limited in their applications. They're used when you have quantitative data associated with categorical data, right? So here we've got home energy consumption in the U.S. and billions of BTUs, quadrillion BTUs. You can think of things like attendance and gender. Gender is a category and attendance is a numerical value. Okay, but there are some restrictions with pie charts that are pretty important, right? Pie charts must, in order for data to qualify to be used to be a pie chart, the categories must be disjoint, and they must represent all of the possible categories, right? So you can imagine. So the disjoint thing means that data can only belong to one of the pieces of pie, right? It must be distinct, right? So males and females and attendance, that data qualifies for a pie chart because you cannot belong to both the male category and the female category simultaneously. I mean, for the sake of argument, we will say that you cannot belong to both of those. Now, in a human sexuality class, we could talk about that, but for the sake of argument, so they must be disjoint. They cannot be overlapping. And they must represent the entire pie. So you can imagine a pie chart where I have freshmen, juniors, and sophomores, and their freshmen, juniors, and sophomores, and their the number of students at DePaul who are freshmen and juniors and sophomores. And if I just showed you that pie chart, 1/3 freshmen, 1/3 sophomores, 1/3 juniors, you would assume that there are no seniors at DePaul, right? And this is one of the key features of a pie chart, is that there is an assumption that if you have a pie chart, it includes all of the possible categories. So if you cannot include all the possible categories, or your data are not disjoint, they do not overlap, or they can't overlap, then you cannot use a pie chart. It has to be a bar chart. So when we look at this data, right, coal, petroleum, natural gas, renewable, nuclear, other, these represent all of the possible sources of energy consumption in the United States, right? So they meet one of our criteria. It's all the possible categories. And they are disjoint, right? If you burn coal, you did not or could not also count that burning of coal as petroleum, right? It is a completely separate thing. It cannot be in both categories at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert our pie chart. So we're going to click Insert. We're going to highlight our data. We're going to Insert. And we're going to insert our pie. Delicious pie. It's going to look something like this. Okay. Now, towards having a complete meaningful graph, we're going to want to include some information. We're going to want to include layout 1, title, and percentages. Now, you don't have to have it this way. There's some flexibility. You definitely have to have a title. But if you end up having, layout 2, or you end up having layout, whatever, well, this one doesn't have a title, but layout 2 also works. Okay. So you're going to want to click on that. We'll give it a title, Energy Consumption in the U.S. Okay, energy consumption in the U.S., and we will also add our source information, clicking on our graph, insert, text box. Text box is there. We'll just type it out. Oops. Insert text box. It's right here. Source. Energy Information Administration. So this counts as a complete meaningful graph, right? It shows all of the possible sources of energy consumption in the United States. They're disjoint, meaning you can't belong to more than one of these categories. Consumption, I can't spell. Whoa! What happened? There's my graph. Okay. So a couple other things about bar charts, common mistakes that students make. So what I'm going to do real quick, oftentimes when you run into bar chart or pie chart data, you will see the total. And oftentimes students will create a pie chart where they include the total. This is wrong. And I'm telling you this now because I can almost guarantee you that one student on the final or one student on the midterm is going to make this mistake. They are going to include the total in their pie chart, and they are going to lose points for it unnecessarily. This is a huge red flag. If half of your pie is one thing, you probably included the total and you need to go back and get rid of it. If you see this, it should be a huge red flag. Another source of problems for students is that oftentimes we have pie charts that have lots of pieces of pie and there isn't enough room to display it all in our charts. So one way around that is that we can actually adjust the size of this pie. And to do that, you have to kind of imagine that there is a square around this circle that touches each of the sides of the circle. So if you can imagine that square that touches the sides, if you click in this corner of that square, somewhere in this area, you can actually get that square to appear. And then you can change the size of your pie chart. And then you can move your text boxes around to make room for all of your text boxes. So I think that's it for pie charts. Remember, pie charts have these two specific criteria. The categories must be disjoint, they must be non-overlapping, and you must have all the possible categories in order to use a pie chart. If you don't meet those criteria, then you just make a bar chart instead. So this should be enough to get you going with the first activity. And then when you have completed the first activity, come back and watch part 2, and then that should give you enough time to complete the second activity. And as always, I'll be available via email all week. Thank you, and have a good day, evening, morning, whatever.